In 1958, American educators examined Soviet mathematics textbooks and were shocked. 10th grade Soviet students were solving problems at the level of American college freshmen. The gap wasn't small, it was enormous. For decades, people have believed that Soviet education was the best in the world. But was it really? Or is this another case of nostalgia hiding uncomfortable truths? The myth didn't come from nowhere. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Soviet students dominated international mathematics and physics olympiads. They consistently outperformed their Western counterparts in competitions that tested pure analytical skills. When the USSR launched Sputnik in 1957, it triggered panic in America. How could a communist country beat the capitalist superpower into space? The answer seemed obvious. Their education system was superior. The Soviet government backed this narrative with impressive statistics. By the 1960s, they claimed nearly 100% literacy across a massive, diverse population. From Leningrad to Vladivostok, every child studied the same curriculum, took the same exams, followed the same textbooks. Education was completely free, from elementary school through university. No tuition, no fees. In theory, a farmer's child had the same opportunities as a factory director's son. This standardization and accessibility became the foundation of the myth, and the Soviet Union needed people to believe this. Every Olympiad medal, every successful rocket launch, every PhD granted was presented as proof that communism worked better than capitalism. So what was actually good about Soviet education? In STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the system was genuinely strong. Soviet high school students learned calculus, differential equations, and advanced physics as standard curriculum. By 10th grade, they covered material that American students wouldn't see until college. Laboratory work was mandatory, even in ordinary schools. Students didn't just memorize formulas. They conducted experiments, built circuits, solved complex multi-step problems. Compare a Soviet 10th grader to an American high school senior in 1975. The Soviet student could solve differential equations, understood thermodynamics at a deep level, and had practical lab experience. The American student might not encounter that material for another 2 or 3 years. This wasn't propaganda. This was measurable reality. Soviet math and physics education set a remarkably high bar. The system also had structural advantages. The unified standard meant predictability and quality control. No child fell through the cracks completely. Everyone was pulled up to at least a minimum level. Discipline was strict. Structure was clear. Teachers held respected social positions and decent salaries. One curriculum, one standard, everyone moves forward together. For training competent engineers and scientists, this worked remarkably well. But here's what the nostalgia leaves out. Soviet education excelled at producing technical specialists, but it systematically destroyed critical thinking. History wasn't taught as a discipline, it was taught as propaganda. Students learned the party's version of events, with no room for alternative interpretations. Wars were glorified, Soviet victories emphasized, failures erased. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? Barely mentioned. Soviet atrocities? Completely absent. Literature classes didn't encourage personal response or analysis. They taught correct conclusions. Every poem, every novel had an official interpretation, and deviating from it meant trouble. Tolstoy wasn't studied for artistic merit. He was studied because the party said he mattered. Modern experimental literature was banned. Foreign authors were carefully filtered. Social studies was even worse. Instead of learning political philosophy, economics, or comparative government, students memorized Marxist-Leninism as absolute truth. There was no debate, no discussion of alternative systems. The goal wasn't to teach students how to think, it was to teach them what to think. And despite all the rhetoric about equality, the system was deeply unequal. Elite specialized schools existed in Moscow and Leningrad. Institutions like School Number 239, the legendary physics-mathematics school that produced more Soviet scientists than entire regions combined. These schools had the best teachers, full laboratories, and professors from top universities teaching advanced seminars. But getting in required connections, influence, or extraordinary luck, children of party officials had access. Children of factory workers in provincial cities did not. Here's a real example of how this worked. In 1976, a student named Grigory Perelman, who would later solve one of mathematics' most famous problems, attended School 239 in Leningrad. He had access to university-level instruction while still in high school, studied under mathematicians who were themselves world-class researchers, and competed in olympiads with other brilliant students. Meanwhile, a gifted student in a village school in Siberia might have one outdated textbook shared among 3 students and a teacher who barely understood calculus. Both were technically receiving Soviet education, but they were living in completely different worlds. The gap was staggering. Elite schools in Moscow and Leningrad produced the overwhelming majority of Soviet scientists and academics, despite representing a tiny fraction of all students. School 239 alone graduated dozens of future members of the Academy of Sciences. Yet officially, the system claimed perfect equality. Everyone had the same opportunities. The statistics said so. The reality was entirely different. University admission revealed the same pattern. Officially, entrance exams were merit-based and fair. In reality, exams could be manipulated. Students with connections received favorable treatment. Others faced deliberately impossible questions designed to fail them, especially if they were Jewish or from other disfavored groups. Talented students were rejected for political reasons, while mediocre students with the right family background sailed through. Perhaps most damaging was what the system did to independent thinking. Students learned there was one correct answer to every question. Finding alternative solutions wasn't encouraged, it was often punished. A student who solved a math problem using an elegant but unconventional method might receive a lower grade than one who followed the textbook exactly. Creativity was suspect, conformity was rewarded. Compare this to Western education of the same era. American and European schools had serious problems: inconsistent quality, inequality, sometimes weak technical training. But Western education aimed at something fundamentally different. It tried to produce citizens capable of independent judgment, not obedient specialists. It encouraged questioning, debate, multiple perspectives. The technical foundation might be weaker, but the mental flexibility was far stronger. The Soviet Union trained its students to be engineers and soldiers, highly competent in narrow fields, obedient to authority, uncomfortable with ambiguity. The West trained students to be adaptable thinkers, maybe weaker in pure technical skills, but better at asking new questions and imagining different possibilities. These were fundamentally different philosophies, producing fundamentally different results. history proved which approach mattered more. Soviet scientists and mathematicians were world-class. But the USSR fell behind in innovation. It couldn't create a Silicon Valley or a thriving tech startup culture. Its research institutes were filled with brilliant minds, working in rigid hierarchies, unable to challenge assumptions or pivot quickly. Meanwhile, American garages and college dorm rooms were producing revolutionary companies. The difference wasn't intelligence, it was mindset. You can teach someone calculus. You can train them to solve complex equations and conduct precise experiments. But if you never teach them to ask why or what if, you've created a very expensive calculator, not a thinker. Soviet education mastered technical training and completely failed to nurture independent thought. So what's the verdict? The myth that Soviet education was the best in the world is a half-truth. In mathematics, physics, and technical sciences, it was genuinely excellent, rigorous, demanding, and effective. If your goal was to train engineers to build rockets and bridges, the Soviet system worked. It created a population with strong analytical skills and solid technical foundations. But education isn't just about solving equations. It's about learning to think, question, adapt, and create. In those areas, Soviet education failed. It produced generations who could calculate perfectly, but struggled to innovate. Who knew the official answers, but couldn't formulate their own questions. Who excelled within systems, but couldn't imagine alternatives. Soviet education created excellent calculators, but calculators don't change the world. Thinkers do. The real question isn't whether Soviet math textbooks were advanced. It's whether education should train obedient specialists or independent minds. The USSR chose one path. History shows what happened next.